So yeah, there's not going to be too much conversation going on. It should hopefully be a smooth handoff. But yeah, one of our XD people renamed our pipeline patterns talk to Max Existentialism just because there were two Maxes doing it. But pipeline patterns doesn't sound that interesting, but hopefully we can get your juices flowing a little bit. So I'm Max Griffiths. I've been doing DevOps stuff for about 10 years, although it obviously hasn't always been called that. I'm a Brit on loan to San Francisco. And I'm currently working for a big corporate enterprisey financial client, but I have worked for startups, and yeah, currently I'm working in Delaware, so that's interesting.
So I'm Max Lincoln. I work for Thoughtworks in New York. I've also been doing it for about DevOps stuff for about 10 years, but only the last 4 kind of calling it DevOps and really focusing on the cultural aspect. Before that, I was just kind of bouncing between doing development, doing operations, and doing testing or being a liaison between the teams. And in addition to working on a lot of helping projects achieve DevOps and implement continuous delivery, I've also done a lot of open source work. I was part of the Swagger working group recently, which is now becoming the Linux Foundation's Open APIs initiative. So I think there's some interesting stuff there.
I was just going to say as well, sorry, that's actually me. I'm not flying there. I was actually flying a kite, but the kite's been cut off, so it kind of looks like I'm flying. And Max gives me a hard time because my face isn't in the photo, but that technically he's like somewhere there. You won't be able to see that at the back. But yeah, so what are we talking about pipelines for? Because people have obviously read books and probably developed a lot of pipelines themselves. But when we started talking about this and thinking, we actually thought that pipelines tend to be like a product of us trying to shift something to production. And especially if you've started on a greenfield project, and then when you get to the end and you actually go to production, you look at this thing and it's like, oh yeah, this is my pipeline. And so what we wanted to try and talk about is how you can be a bit more kind of proactive and start thinking about some of those scaling challenges up front and some of the decisions and patterns that you might be able to choose. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we could have talked about with pipelines. There's obviously like huge books that have been written about it. One of the things we're not talking about is a value stream map. Who knows what a value stream map is? This is actually a really effective business tool if you're actually trying to map out your real business workflow, or some people call it concept to cash, and actually looking at where the waste is, where are you actually spending time in the process, versus kind of handing off between processes. So this is a really good thing to do, but we're not going to talk about it. We could talk about Dockers, because everybody likes talking about that, or even better, Linux containers, because that's what it is, LXC at the root, but we're not going to talk about that. Kubernetes and Mesos and schedulers and stuff like that is a really cool hot topic at the moment, but we're not talking about that. We could talk about how Jenkins doesn't do continuous delivery very well. By the way, I saw a guy with a Jenkins t-shirt. I'm really sorry about that. So, but there's lots of books. So these have been mentioned already. Go and read some of those, they're really good. And actually recently we've just had the Thoughtworks Technology Radar come out. It comes out every twice a year, and it's got lots of sort of highly opinionated people talking about tech and frameworks and things like that. But what we are going to focus on anyway is how pipelines can actually affect governance, culture, and feedback, and some of the decisions that you make, how those can affect those 3 things.
So I think we've got a big group here. There's, I know, continuous delivery when it came out won some awards. There were a lot of people that bought it. So I think a lot of people are bought into the idea that they should be doing pipelines. But if we're going to start talking about patterns, it's not just should you do pipelines. We need to start thinking about what we think makes a pipeline good or not, so that we can try and decide which of these patterns do the things we want. So when we thought about what we think makes a good pipeline, we said, first of all, it needs to be providing incremental quality assurance of your release candidate. That's the main purpose of pipelines. And you also want to be getting fast feedback to the right people. So you've got that incremental feedback, but as soon as you detect a problem, you want to notify the right people that there's a potential issue they need to fix. But we also think that pipelines, because they really become the working model of your software delivery process, you can use them to start really having visibility and shared understanding of what your software release process is, and the progress that each of your release candidates are making towards going to production or beta or whatever you're releasing. And finally, a lot of organizations, especially when you start getting into bigger enterprises, governance and auditing is a major thing. And one of the nice benefits of continuous delivery or a lot of DevOps practices is, since you're automating things, you're doing them in a consistent way, and hopefully you're doing them with tools that have some kind of tracking so that you can go and show to the auditors exactly how changes got from development to production. And so we're also going to talk about, when we look at pipelines, we look at the pipelines that you kind of see in textbooks and the articles and stuff, and it starts out simple enough. But then when you get into real world projects, you find you start with your simple pipelines, but you need to start growing them to handle these different concerns. So you need to grow out in terms of, at some enterprises, they have more and more levels of testing they want to do. So you end up with these really long pipelines. You have some where you end up having a lot of different teams involved, especially if you do microservices. So you need to grow in terms of the number of related pipelines you're dealing with. And if you're releasing quickly, we try and minimize it. But the third dimension is sometimes you end up having to support multiple concurrent versions. So maybe if you're just software as a service, maybe it's just like prod and a beta. If you're doing like a desktop application, you might actually have to support several simultaneously.
Cool. So yeah, I was just going to kind of cover some common language, because different tools call things differently, right? So this is kind of where we think that we're trying to get to in terms of the goal. We've got some stages that we need to get through. We've got some versions. Hopefully this isn't sort of an alien concept to people, but we've got different versions coming down here, different stages in the pipelines. Things go red because we want them to, and we learn from that, and then we push in fixes and we go green. So we call these things materials. Like, where does the pipeline actually start? So it normally starts, hopefully everybody here is kind of committing to version control. 5-10 years ago, this wasn't necessarily a thing. People might just have it on disk somewhere. So this is what we call a material. Materials then trigger jobs. This is normally some sort of script. This is all pretty basic stuff. But when you start building these things out, it's not just a series of connected jobs that you find. You're trying to build things into sort of more business functions. So we call this a stage. This is some terminology that some tools are using. Not everybody, so just kind of bear with us on that. And your stages tend to be sequential, so once stage 1 is done, stage 2 comes in. You can also have some concurrency in there as well, so maybe build and lint testing is actually happening in sequence. And again, this comes down to how you want to plan out your feedback and visualizations, things like that. You might also want to publish your artifacts to an artifact repository, so Artifactory, Nexus, things like this are kind of in that space. The opposite of that is actually passing artifacts down the pipeline from one job to another. You need to think about storage and things like that, but this is just a different sort of style. And so we build things. There's a nice little box there, and just for sort of brevity, it's not that clear on the slide, but we're just kind of squashing things down and showing how actually what we might call a pipeline, so we might have a build pipeline, an acceptance pipeline, an exploratory pipeline. We can connect these together to form our sort of holistic end-to-end pipeline. We're shifting artifacts between those different environments or kind of proving stages. And then you can obviously build things up to be a little bit more complex, where you get some parallelism in there as well.
Okay, so as we start building out a lot of pipelines, we land on a project and we start doing continuous delivery. We can start, and the simplest projects are places that are essentially just taking their code and putting it in production with no real testing in between. Hopefully that's not happening. So this is kind of the simplest textbook example we would usually see, where you've got your source, you build it, you create some type of deployable artifact. Hopefully you just build it once and you don't rebuild it in each subsequent stage. You run all of your acceptance tests, and if that's all good, you deploy to production. When you start working in larger organizations, then they say they want to start adding more and more of these levels of tests.
Yeah, so it's like the answer to this is not to kind of stop people testing, right? People might want to add in more stages. This is pretty common, right? You have security testing, performance testing, yada, yada, yada. But the answer isn't just to say, no more testing. But you might want to start having a look at. But yeah, sorry. So the thing is, when you add those more stages in there, you do start to lose a little bit of that feedback, because your feedback to developers from security or performance in this example is pretty slow. So that's why the feedback kind of disappears there. So you might look at, like, how can we parallelize this stuff? Like, what's the thinking that actually goes into the level of quality that goes into QA, or the level of quality that goes into test? So this is our sort of parallelism pattern. One of the examples that I've got of the client that I'm working on at the moment is that they had this kind of scenario where they had, all of this was pretty much automated except for QA, where they had a lot of developers who were sort of doing exploratory testing. And there was a whole team of people who were working really, really hard on automating as much of the stuff that was going on in QA. So all of these automated tests went into this thing called int, which is integration, and test. And then, when we actually looked at it, we realized that there was, as they were transitioning to more automation, only about 15% of the code base was actually getting tested in these stages. And 85% of it was actually getting tested in this QA environment, which was actually taking, because we had all of this automation going, and it took a little bit of a long time. So it was taking anywhere between 2 and 6 hours to actually get the majority of the code base tested in QA. And that's actually a really long time. And especially when you think about expensive humans that are actually sitting looking at that environment and waiting 6 hours, that's a lot of waste that you've got there. So I sort of proposed this crazy idea of, look, let's just ship this thing from build all the way to QA. And of course, all the people that have been working tirelessly on the automated tests went, well, we don't know the quality. But actually, when it came down to it, there was quite a lot of testing that was going on inside the build. They had some unit tests, some functional tests. And the likelihood of actually taking down QA because of an erroneous build and preventing testers from testing was very, very small, versus the advantage of actually getting things in there every half an hour. So it's not necessarily scalable. I mean, you could do this, but again, you really need to think about the quality of the product that you're trying to ship into security. So maybe it's good enough for QA, maybe the site comes up, maybe people can click around on some stuff. It doesn't mean that it's going to be good enough for security or perf necessarily. But again, this does give you feedback, right? Because you're able to ship those things straight into those environments and get those security guys saying, no, this is no good. And from a governance perspective, obviously, you're introducing these teams into the pipeline. And security teams, I don't know about you guys, but the company that I work in at the moment, it's a big bank. They have their security team kind of sits behind closed doors and feel very sort of separate from the process. And giving them real estate in the pipeline, you really start to get more visibility. At least product owners now see visibly, like, how far is it really until my product's going to ship to production.
Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about, that was essentially the problem with scaling out, and you've got pipelines that are becoming long and the feedback's slowing down. We're going to talk a bit about potential patterns we've seen places use to try and solve these. We don't have enough time to go into every pattern we can think of, so we're just going to do it briefly, but we've put a GitHub repo where we're trying to collect more of these patterns we'll share at the end. So first, you can just basically start with a simple linear pipeline, and if you have a simple application you're doing, this may be the best possible thing because it's simple, everyone can understand it, and it's going to be fast if you don't have too many stages. But if you start having a lot of things, you may want to just go around, talk to teams, and say, which of these things could we do in parallel? This works for a while, but when you start getting really big, I don't like this because some of the conversations and some of the managing the dependencies between pipelines can get tricky. So what I've started doing is these layered pipelines where we, instead of just saying which things can run in parallel and going around and having those conversations, we try and divide the pipeline itself into layers based on how confident we are in that release candidate. So you can kind of associate a layer with, like, one layer might be like 60% sure things are working, then like 80% and 90%, and then you're in production. And when I first did this, to make it really simple for everyone, not just the people designing the pipelines or the developers to understand, we called it Olympic pipelines, and we just did it based on the Olympics medals. So I don't know if you can see it, but we have these layers labeled as bronze, silver, and gold. And so it changed the culture a little bit because we had people stop talking about, however different teams were talking about the release process in different ways before, and then we would have like product owners start saying like, is this feature silver yet? And what kind of testing has to happen before this can go from bronze to silver? So it really changed the communication, not just the design of the pipeline. Another thing that's nice with this, if your artifact retention policies or anything like that is starting to become tricky, you can associate layers with different artifact repositories, either a real one or at least a virtual one in products that support it. So you could say, ideally you would just keep every release candidate forever, but if you're building like OpenStack image, like a glance image or something as your artifact so that every build is producing gigabytes worth of artifacts, you might not be able to keep everything. So you could say, we're going to keep bronze stuff for 2 weeks, we'll keep silver stuff for 2 months, and we'll keep gold stuff for 2 years. And you have a simple way to do that because you're promoting it anyways. This can also easily support kind of release channels. So if you look at Chrome or lots of other projects, a lot of times both internal teams or even external users, if you've got like beta users and early adapters, you might take your silver repository and open it up to your beta users so that you could say every time something gets this far along in our pipeline, they'll be able to pull it right from there. As soon as it gets promoted, it becomes available. Okay. So the next type of scaling challenge we have is when you've been working on an application, you've got this pipeline that's going to production, it's all working great, and then your architects or tech leads come along and they say, hey, we want to do microservices now, so we're going to take that one application and we're going to split it up into 4 different applications. I don't remember who first wrote it, but I love microservices and those things, but I do think it's true that they trade development complexity for operational complexity. So even though they're great, the deployment, the pipeline, all of those things, some of those problems will get a little harder. So with this, you can basically clone all of their pipelines, and you can have everybody independently going to production. But what might end up happening is, if those services are truly, they're probably independently deployable, and they should have good contracts between each other, but they are still related. They are still somewhat interdependent, and so you could have incompatible combinations of these services that need to talk to each other. So you might want to do the first portion of your pipeline independently, but at some point you're going to say, we want to take a group of these applications and we want to do our final end-to-end testing, our performance testing, our security scanning, all of those things on this as essentially a system of systems, and make sure that that's what gets promoted to production.
I think the reality is as well is that not everybody has like the capacity or the money to just create like 50 different performance environments as well, right? So people are always trying to reuse. So this is less of a, yes, definitely do this, it definitely has benefits, but it's more likely that you will have to do this, right?
So this looks okay, but when you combine this with the first problem, and we were saying you might want to do some things in parallel to speed it up, you may end up with something more like this, where there's not a clear point where it's all going to fan in. You want to do your functional tests and your performance tests at the same time. One thing this makes really hard that I like to do is having these meaningful version labels that get propagated down the pipeline. And so each of these applications have their own independent versions, but when you get to this point, you have them all fanning in here, and you have them fanning in here. You don't really know what to label things because it's now this group of 4 applications. Plus, test and perf, you don't really know which one will run first or if it's going to be in a different order. So there's no longer a clear version number for you to use later in the pipeline.
So just sort of recapping on some of the patterns there for the scaling out for multiple projects. And also for the for the labeling as well. So here, as Max just mentioned, actually having a consistent label that's passing down the pipeline. And this might sound like Mickey Mouse to some people, but some people do just have different counters for everything. And so
that's usually the default.
Right. So yeah, it's normally the default in the tools. So you're not really at fault here. From the culture aspect, you start getting devs, QA, security folks talking about the same release, regardless of where it is on the pipeline. So that gives you that kind of common language. And from a governance perspective, when you're trying to ship something, it's a little bit more traceable to find out exactly what is in that particular release, right? Rather than restamping it with a different number every time it hits a different stage. As you're about to ship something for production, maybe you've got some traceability back to your Jira or your agile tracking tool or whatever, so you can actually see what are the products that are going to be going into this release. Actually taking the version control system labeling coming through, this is the VCS labeling pattern. So, we really like this. Again, it just adds even more traceability back, so you can even do like an SVN log or Git log, whatever your tool of choice is. And then the joint labeling, which doesn't scale so well, but certainly if you've got 2 or 3 projects that are merging in together, then just aggregate the labels. That's good.
We see that a lot with if you've got like a version of your infrastructure and a version of your application. So like we might take a repository that has chef cookbooks and a repository with like a Spring application, merge the 2 of them together and go forward.
But as said, it doesn't. You don't really want these. If you've got 50 microservices, you're not going to have a 50-point version number, or you would if you're crazy. So there is room to be aggregating these, and you just need to figure out what makes sense. Also, from a governance perspective, actually, once you've grouped these things together, producing some sort of artifact, some manifest, some change list that then actually gets published as an artifact as well, with references back to the old repos.
Okay, and again, like I said earlier, you can have the independent pipelines, and if these are really unrelated applications, or if you have really strong contract testing so that you're fairly confident that as long as like these guys still have compatible APIs and all of their tests say like it's all backwards compatible, then maybe you can have everything going into production independently, and this gives you the most flexibility over your schedule, and you have a lot less environment contention. But in most places I've been, this is the more realistic thing, where you're going to have independent pipelines to some point, but you need to merge fan in at some point and do the kind of final go ahead. And so that brings us to the last axis, where we have to support multiple concurrent releases. So basically the problem here is, again, you start with a simple pipeline, or maybe a not so simple if you've come through those other 2 axes first. But then maybe you were just developing for a while, but now you're actually in production, and they say, well, we now have to support the current production release in addition to starting to work on the next releases. So you start having potentially something more like this. This is one way you may see it happen, where you just essentially have separate pipelines for each of the releases that are coming up. So, if you've got productions version 1, you could have a team that's working on 1.1 and a team that's working on version 2.0. This is something I've seen happen a lot, and I've seen companies think that they can essentially be doing, more frequent releases by just having a lot of different teams that are all working in parallel. And they've got Jenkins, or even they've got Go, so they think they're releasing often and they're doing continuous integration because they have the right tools. So I think a major thing there that has been pointed out many times before, but should again, is that the tools aren't the practices. There's a lot of CI and CD tools to help you implement the practices, but you can take a continuous integration tool and fail to do continuous integration with it. So I've definitely seen that, where you've got 3 different teams, and what often ends up happening is you start having a branch or separate repository per team. So 3 teams with their own pipelines, with their own version control system, and they all think they're doing continuous integration, But they're missing the key aspect of continuous integration, that not just everyone commits every day, but everyone commits to the same branch every day. So you at least need a development branch or some kind of integration branch that even if you have these teams, maybe they have their own branches, but they're also merging it to a shared branch. When that's not happening, what I've seen is the team that's supporting production, maybe they get fairly fast feedback because their change goes in and it's just got this short pipeline to production and it's direct. They can see the whole thing in a tool. The team that's working on the release that's the furthest out isn't going to get all of their feedback, not just before it goes through the whole pipeline, but there may be some merge stages in there that aren't visible in the pipeline itself. And that, I think, is also the most concerning, because a lot of times what happens is you take this team that's the farthest out and you say, well, they're going to work on version 2.0. They're going to do all of these major changes, but they're not getting any of the feedback. So they'll make a lot of changes and think it's all good until you have just merge hell and you realize you've wasted a couple of months. So the patterns for that, a lot of these are pretty related to branch patterns. So Paul Hammett has written a lot about trunk-based development. So basically that kind of thing where you've got different projects or releases working at different times all on different branches. That's what you don't want to have. And what this is trying to show here, all of the stuff that's red, those are basically stuff that people are working on, but it's not really in a deployable state. So you've got all of these unintegrated branches that maybe the tests are passing, but you can't merge it with the stuff to go to production. So instead, release branches aren't horrible. You can still have release branches even when you're doing trunk-based development. But instead of, to me, the key is if you're creating a release branch to start development on a release that is like 2 months out, then it's just not going to work. Branching a couple of days before a release in order to stabilize it and to be able to do patches on that release is okay.
So, I mean, what do the pipeline patterns look like? Those are branching diagrams you saw before. So there are some tools that are doing this out of the box now. So the top one there is your trunk, where you're cycling very, very quickly every day, but nothing actually ships to production from the end of that one. So, you know, you could just give that incrementing numbers. But at some point you say, hey, we're going to ship it, cut your release branch, and actually duplicate your pipelines. So the first 3 stages here are exact replicas of the ones above, and this is a really safe way of just knowing. But you know, if you have a lot of automated tests, this is a really good pattern. If you have a lot of different testing teams, then obviously you have to kind of multiply those across these different stages, and that's expensive. But the idea is that you can then branch for release, and then as soon as you have a fix to commit to production, if you're live with release 1, you just commit it into this branch, and then it goes through your whole pipeline, hopefully quickly, and you can hit production. The other one that we were talking about that is less good in certain tools, especially Subversion. Who uses Subversion still? Oh, I pity you. Yeah, I mean, we're using it, right? It's a big thing. We do. It's in the enterprise. A lot of people are using it, you know, as they are using Maven as well. But long-lived, you know, if your tool does merges well and people like merges and it's a small team and they're very technical and they all understand the code base, then fine, you know, merging is good. But generally, this is something that I try to stay away from. And then the other one is if people are using GitHub a lot, then this idea of kind of having stages to just very quick testing stages to make sure that you're not going to break trunk when you merge into it. So this is that sort of pull request model. Just one last bit before we go. It doesn't all have to be about kind of commit pipelines. So I've been doing a lot of work recently on developer workstations. And we're in the cloud, we're using OpenStack. So this concept of base image, a lot of developers that are in my ecosystem are using Windows desktops, right? And they're developing for Linux systems. So it's really painful that companies are still forcing people to use Windows when they're developing for Linux. So actually trying to have the same base image. So we've got Vagrant and VirtualBox and that stuff. So whatever it is, whatever your base image is, it's this concept of taking your original pipeline, just speeding up now because I'm running out of time. But the idea is that you have some sort of image pipeline, some sort of CD that you've taken from Red Hat or Ubuntu or whatever, and you do some stuff to it. And maybe you do nothing to it and you just stick that straight into your repository. But for the most part, you want to do something. There's some kind of SSH settings, or there's some sort of LDAP credentials that you need to bake into that image. But the nice thing is that once you've done that, Pack is going to let you take it out to a VirtualBox image or a Vagrant Box image, or and then also into an AMI, which your environments can then consume.
Okay, so that's it, except that I turned this off.
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, so obviously we're starting to think about these patterns because we're just kind of seeing and solving the same problems repeatedly, especially because we're consultants, so we go around and see it at different organizations. So we just kind of wanted to start collecting some of the ideas and knowledge. So we talked about a few of the ones we had time to document. There's a ton more even just that we've been thinking about that we couldn't include. And so to try and get our stuff, but also we wanted to try and get more ideas from the community, and if people are interested, we threw a repo up on GitHub so that you can just write some markdown, send a pull request, or talk about patterns you find interesting.
It's really strange how little people are talking about this stuff, so either it's because they don't care and we're wasting our time, or it's just because, like I said, it's just always a reaction of people's process rather than thinking behind it. So just kind of parting words, it's not just a product, but it is an opportunity for you to kind of improve the things that we talked about, so feedback, the culture, and the overall governance of it.